Hello and welcome to No Spin. I'm Nidhi Razdan. The global economy is facing many headwinds at the moment. There was the pandemic, lockdowns, and now a geopolitical crisis spurred by Russia's invasion of Ukraine, which is causing everyone a lot of pain. From high fuel prices to food grain shortages, it is a challenging time for most of the world's leading economies, including India. Despite high inflation, officials in India are still optimistic about our overall growth prospects. But what is at the heart of this optimism? For ordinary folks, these are difficult times. Just yesterday, the central bank hiked a key interest rate, which has made our loans, home loans, personal loans, much more expensive. Food, fuel, everything is costing us much more. So what actually is the state of the economy and what does the future hold? Joining us now on NDTV is Arvind Subramanian, former Chief Economic Advisor to the Government of India from 2014 to 2018 and now Senior Fellow with Brown University's Watson Institute for International and Public Affairs. Arvind Subramanian, wonderful to have you on the show once again. Thank you for joining us. If you just look at the sort of the picture, the big picture of what's happening in the world at the moment, we are seeing high inflation in many leading economies. The US, the UK, Germany are all seeing record high inflation at the moment. China's economy is slowing down. We're facing headwinds. Given the situation globally, how do you think India is placed at the moment?
Yeah, it's a great question. I think, first of all, let's break up India's prospects into the international environment, and then we'll talk about the domestic, response and the challenges domestically. I think what is really important to understand about the international economy today, which is different from the past, is that we are seeing the specter of global stagflation. The World Bank has just revised its growth forecast for the global economy. And, for the global economy, anything less than 2% is considered a recession. So we're not just having high international prices of, fuel, fertilizers, food, etc. We're also having a global growth slowdown. Now, this is a double whammy for India because one, we are major net importers of fuel and things like that. Therefore, we're going to face the price shocks from the global economy, also higher imports and so on. So that's a negative shock on prices. But at the same time, the global economy is slowing down, which means that exports, which did very well last year, are going to slow down. So both on the growth side and the inflation side, there are shocks. Previously, for example, we've had situations where oil prices went up, but that was along with a very vibrant global economy. If you take, the early 2000s, but so at least there, even though oil prices went up, we had the advantage of a booming economy, so we could export a lot more. So global stagflation is a real double risk, both on the inflation side, and of course, it has consequences for the budget. Fuel subsidies will be higher, tax collections will be lower, fertilizer subsidies will be higher. So the fiscal account will also be very adversely affected. So it's this global stagflation that's going to be a real, it's something that we have to, it's certainly going to affect how high prices are. It's certainly also going to moderate a growth from the last year going forward.
So when the government says and when government officials and the ministers say that, India is better placed, our macroeconomics are much more stable, etc., is some of that spin, I'm asking that on our show called No Spin, is some of that a lot of positive spin? Or when we compare ourselves, let's say, to China at the moment, which is slowing down, does that actually give India an opportunity to do something and, positive?
Okay, I'll come to the China opportunity in just a second, which is, I think, a real opportunity. But let me take up your question of, is this spin or not spin? I think to say that, we are a little better off in terms of our cushion. Our foreign exchange reserves are high. Our exports did well last year. And last year, the revenues also did very well. Government revenues did very well. And so, we were chugging along. But I think what is different and where I would be a little bit cautious about the optimism is that our macroeconomic situation is not as comfortable as it used to be in the past. I think people have forgotten here, and there's a bit of amnesia here, that our inflation rate has been high for about almost 3 years. Since October 2019, our inflation rate has been above 4%. And for half that time, it's been above 6%, which is the RBI's upper ceiling for inflation. So we've had very high inflation for a very long time. And as you quite rightly said, high inflation is a tax on the poor because people in the informal sector don't have the protections against higher inflation. So I think to say that, it's all hunky-dory and that we are much better protected, that we're in very comfortable shape, is, I think, stretching it a little bit, because our macroeconomic situation is now a little bit more vulnerable than it has been in the past. So I would be very, and of course, our budget fiscal accounts also has become much more vulnerable as a result of these external, as a result of the external environment. So I would be, I would resist any, attempt or thing at complacency. This is a fairly difficult situation, which we have to be, managed very carefully. But now let me come to one, you mentioned China. I think that, as I see it, the real opportunity for India is in fact China related. What has happened in the last 10 years is that China has been becoming less and less competitive. Its exports have been declining, and that's natural. And we calculate, Soumitra Chatterjee and I, that China vacated something like $150 billion, less exports it did. And India should have filled that opportunity, but it didn't, for all kinds of reasons, which we can look into. But on top of that, what is happening now is that capital is fleeing China for geopolitical reasons. Investors are saying, there's this US-China conflict. B, we don't understand what Xi Jinping is doing. He's certainly kind of running the economy to the ground in some ways. So they are fleeing. Now, that is a real opportunity for India. But here again, I think opportunity does not automatically translate into outcomes. We have to do a lot to create the environment to attract investment, so that we can invest more and export more.
I wanted to ask you about that, because for some reason Vietnam seems to be doing this better than us. The guys who are leaving China are saying, okay, we're going to set up shop in Vietnam instead, and India doesn't come on top in that. Why is that? Why are we still not able to get people to come here and manufacture here?
Can I answer that in a slightly roundabout way? Because I'm going to come to that. Because, I thought we were going to talk about the RBI and inflation.
Next.
Okay, but let me prejudge, because I want to link the two. You see, what has been a little bit somewhat, disappointing is that, we've all been talking about whether the RBI has been too late, et cetera, right? But actually, what has been disappointing is not just that inflation has been very high and that the RBI has been late to the game, but that, it smacks of a certain loss of institutional independence and credibility that, that's a broader phenomenon. And that's why I'm going to come to that in response to your question on Vietnam. If you take, for example, inflation, it's been high for, as I said, for over 2 years and 9 months. The RBI has been late to the game. It's once again started, targeting multiple things instead of just, it's been defending the rupee. All these things were not part of the mandate. And T.N. Nainan of the Business Standard made a very good point when he said that, the RBI is treating the 6% ceiling as the target. Its target is 4%. And, so much more action should have been taken. And you see, you get the sense that, look, institutions in India, the RBI is like, I would say on the economic sphere, is like the Supreme Court, right? We don't want conflict between these two institutions, clearly, but we don't want the RBI to become an extension of the government either. When the RBI does not...
Is that what you think it's becoming or has become, an extension of the government?
Well, there is evidence, just to give you one concrete example, right? When inflation goes up, essentially the RBI is meant to raise interest rates, to kind of get the situation under control. But it hasn't done that partly because, if you raise interest rates, the government, interest burden goes up. So we call this fiscal dominance. That is, the fiscal situation dominates monetary policy. That's a kind of very technical way of saying that, the RBI is kind of doing what the government wants it to do rather than what it's supposed to do, which is to bring inflation down. So I say this, now let's move to the bigger picture, which is that, if, for example, institutions are not going to be as robust as they ought to be, it takes a toll on the broader investment climate as well. Now, that's where your question becomes very relevant. Why aren't investors coming to India and are choosing Vietnam, Bangladesh, Indonesia instead, right? Of course, part of the reason, of course, as you know, is that we have a policy of Atmanirbharta, which is, we're becoming protectionist, we've raised tariffs. So India is just not a very attractive place from which to export to the rest of the world. So Atmanirbharta is clearly a problem in attracting investment that can service the global market. So that's one big point. To be fair to the government, in the last few weeks, months, it started negotiating these free trade agreements, kind of with an eye of saying,
but is it sending a contradictory message on one hand, talking about Atmanirbharta, and then on the other hand, the Prime Minister, when he travels abroad, he does, talk about the ease of doing business and, trying to attract investors to come to India. So is there a contradiction here? Are we not clear? Is the government not clear exactly about what it wants to do?
Yeah, I certainly think there's a tension between Atmanirbharta, or to put it even more bluntly, if you have to, negotiate all these free trade agreements, you have to, kind of abandon Atmanirbharta. You can't have high tariffs because all these agreements require you to reduce your trade barriers. So there is a tension, and the government will have to sort it out. But the broader point, I think, here is that, the investment climate, there's, too much arbitrariness in policy. Some investors are favored over other investors. Some domestic, companies, well known, are favored over others. Rules change all the time. So the atmosphere, the trust for both foreign and domestic investors. We wrote a piece a few months ago saying we call this software, i.e., see the broader policy making apparatus, what it takes, to have steady rules, to not be inconsistent, to reassure investors, to have social harmony, for example. All these things are very important to attract, really long-term investment. And I think, and you have to have independent institutions. You can't have regulators favoring one company over another company. And so all these things matter. We also need much better, a more cooperative relationship between the center and the states. So all these go towards contributing to an environment that is good for investment. And for the moment, we're kind of missing that.
Right, exactly. I was coming to this point actually on over-centralization and the fact that, you keep seeing the center and states literally at loggerheads, whether it's on GST, fuel taxes, etc. And therefore, how much of a fundamental problem does that create in a system that is actually so fundamentally federal as ours is, when you have this instinct from the center to control everything? And how much of a sort of hindrance is that to our growth prospects?
Yeah, I think, even if you take the farm laws, for example, right, I think, leave aside the substance, I think had there been more, cooperation, discussion, consultation, because, as I keep saying, one of the biggest achievements of the government for all its problems was the GST. And the GST was done in the spirit of cooperative federalism, where there was give and take, there was compensation, everyone surrendered some sovereignty. But that has gone missing, these last few years. And unless we get that, because it's something that investors look at very carefully as well. They say, is there going to be kind of peace and stability? But I think here, just one point here, one has to be careful also in saying that only the center is to blame. I think on a lot of issues, this whole populism, for example, this populism that's kind of taken hold. Yeah, I'm now going to call it not just competitive, but imitative populism. One state does one thing, so the others copy that. So it's kind of an imitative competitive populism. And, for example, if you take the power sector, which is now in really bad shape, I think a lot of the blame there goes with state governments for giving free power, not managing their discoms properly. So I think that clearly the center has to take the lead in creating an atmosphere of trust and cooperation. But I think it's also incumbent now more and more on the states also to be responsible, because these are very challenging times and the center and states have to come together to solve many of these challenges.
You mentioned social harmony in passing. Now, this is an important issue. In India is sort of, witnessing quite a churn, to put it mildly, at the moment when it comes to that issue. How important is that to project stability to the rest of the world, to tell investors, the messaging for investors, when they see Hindu-Muslim conflicts, being sort of played up, what has just happened with Gulf countries in the last few days, how does that affect the investment climate?
I think that's a great question. And I would answer it in two parts. I think, let's focus just domestically. I think, all the experience shows that if you have domestic social conflict, consistent for a very long time, it's going to take a toll on investment. See, the thing is that the timing is unclear here. For a long period of time, many countries in the past, have managed to suppress this and create a climate, but then sooner or later it catches up with you. And I think Sri Lanka is a great example of, a domestic conflict finally catching up with that. So in the long run, if you don't have social peace, if you don't have social harmony, it is going to be a drag on investment, because people say, you invest, suddenly there's a riot, and what happens to my factory? But it's now the international dimension, I think, that's become very, very interesting. See, the way I like to put this is that if you look at the Ukraine conflict, the big theme that's running through the global economy is that we once thought interdependence was good. People, as the famous saying, if countries trade goods, they don't trade blows. That was the, trade as a kind of way of integrating countries, creating peace, because the incentives for conflict diminish. But what has happened in the last, especially with the response to Ukraine, is that interdependence has become weaponized. So, for example, when the West said, you, Russia, you earned all this foreign exchange, sorry, it's going to be useless because we're going to freeze those and not accept your money anymore. Now, it is in that context that, we forget that if we have so many Indian workers abroad, we are potentially vulnerable to this kind of weaponization of interdependence. So it's unfortunate that, it's because of external threats and pressures that, the impetus for social harmony is being realized. But, I think we should take whatever we get for the sake of greater social harmony at home. And I think that we are very vulnerable on this score. We have a lot of Indians living in the Gulf countries. And, and it's not just governments, these overseas governments that might get annoyed with, the lack of social harmony in India. I worry, for example, that, I don't know whether you remember 3 or 4 weeks ago, a famous football star called Mesut Ozil, he tweeted something on, the lack of social harmony in India. Now, these are things that you can't predict, but these are things that can really catch fire. And the fact that it hasn't happened should give us no confidence that it will not happen in the future. These are very flammable things that can happen, and the repercussions are just massive. So we need social harmony for itself. I mean, let's be clear on that thing, not because of anything else, but we also need it for a stable investment climate and for, a stable, our stable relations internationally, for the safety of our citizens internationally. So I think in a number of dimensions, I think, therefore, social harmony and peace are really very important.
Finally, Mr. Subramanian, just to ask you on the original issue, which was, the RBI and the fact that it's now doing these hikes in its key interest rates, and we're expecting more hikes to follow. Is that the right path that they are finally on? And how much pain should all of us here who have loans, how much pain should we expect to be in, and for how long?
Well, the funny thing is that the forecast given by the RBI itself for this year, which people think is kind of a little bit of an underestimate, itself is well above the ceiling that the RBI is mandated to achieve. So, it's something like 7%. I mean, the mandate requires them to bring it down to 4% over some reasonable period of time. So, so clearly, maybe, some global prices are cooling off. Maybe some of it will happen automatically. But I suspect that the RBI, here it's not just to actually achieve the outcome, but to show that it has the desire, the will, and the independence to achieve that. That also is very important here. So I think we're going to see interest rate hikes for some time, and how long that will be will depend, of course, on the external situation as well.
All right. Well, Arvind Subramanian, always a pleasure to talk to you. Thank you very much for giving us your perspective on what is perhaps the most important story we're dealing with today. Thanks very much.
Thanks a lot for having me.